Hello and welcome to The Last Word and a special exclusive interview with the former Prime Minister of Great Britain, Tony Blair. Mr. Blair, let's start with your current role as the representative of the Quartet in the Middle East. In 2009, you said that you were optimistic of a solution. Today, after the fairly vicious fighting that we've seen in November, how badly dented is that optimism?
Well, it is a bit dented, frankly, because we're at an impasse at the moment. On the other hand, the basic rationale for peace remains. The only solution that's going to work is a secure state of Israel, a viable, independent, sovereign state of Palestine. We either do it now, wait 20 years and do it, wait 50 years and do it, but it's the only solution that works. So, yes, there is a big challenge right now. We've got to get the whole thing back on track again. With President Obama's re-election, we've got a chance to do that, but it still remains, long term, I'm still optimistic because it's the only thing that makes sense.
One of the reasons why people, unlike you, are not long-term optimistic is because they say that perhaps the single biggest obstacle to a solution is Israel's obstinate insistence on building and protecting settlements on Palestine land. To what extent do you agree with that view?
It is an obstacle, but it's not the only one. And actually, the simplest way of dealing with it is to get to an agreement on borders. Some of the settlements will come to the State of Israel on the land swap agreement, because the basic principle is you base the state on 67 borders, but with agreed land swaps, which mean that you take account of the settlements. And, settlements still, the degree of land swaps, are between kind of like 2%, 6%, even if you want to push it further, which some people might want to do, and probably not a very good idea, but you're not talking about something that is presently impossible to see a way around. You could still get a solution, but if we leave it a long time without a viable process, then I agree it becomes an increasing obstacle.
But is Benjamin Netanyahu amenable to that line of thinking?
I hope so. I think so, actually, in principle, but you got to get a credible negotiation underway. And for the Palestinians, they need to know this is not just going to be talking for the sake of talking, it's going to result in something.
The Palestinians today, particularly if you look at Hamas, are a reinvigorated outfit. They believe that they have come out of the November fighting as the victors. Does that renewed strength and confidence make a solution, or the quest for a solution, more difficult, or strangely, does it make it easier?
Well, that's a very good question. I think the changes in the region at one level complicate things. The big change in Egypt is a huge factor, not just in what's happened in Gaza, but for the politics of the whole region. And, Israel feels a little less secure now in the region. The Palestinian divisions in politics are still there and in a way accentuated by some of the developments in the region. However, having said all of that, look, in the end, the only way the Palestinians are going to get a state is through a process of negotiation.
Khalid Mashal, just last weekend, actually went on record to say that we will never recognize Israel. Now, that's intransigence is a problem for you that is very difficult to handle.
One of the things you learn in the Middle East is that people say a lot of things, so you've got to discount a certain amount.
So this is rhetoric.
I hope so, because if it's not, then the state of Israel is not going to disappear.
But can you convince Benjamin Netanyahu that this is just rhetoric and not obstacle?
Well, the Israeli politicians will often also use rhetoric. I think underneath the surface, by the way, a majority of people, Palestinians and Israelis, they would take peace if you offered it to them.
Let's widen our discussion. You mentioned Egypt a moment ago, and there's no doubt that there's a lot of concern about political developments in Egypt. And even though recently President Morsi has annulled his decree giving him sweeping powers, the constitutional draft is going to go through a fairly controversial referendum in a couple of days' time. Do you believe that the Arab Spring and the hopes it generated 2 years ago is slowly but steadily souring?
No, I still think that long term this is a development that is positive. But I do think once you've cast off these very repressive regimes, you're then left really with a battle between two elements. One are what I would call sort of open-minded, more liberal, more secular elements who are often numerous but badly organized. And then you have Islamist elements that are numerous and very well organized. Now, ultimately, we're going to have to find a way of reconciling a strong belief in faith and in Islam with a pluralistic democracy. But, you know, democracy, and you know, this took us centuries to develop, but democracy only works with an open mind and is as much about a way of thinking as it is about a way of voting.
Except that that open mind is not being lived up to. Sometimes it's not even being exhibited by those in control of Egypt today. They seem to have a narrow, defined idea of what their society should be, and the liberals, led by El-Baradei or by whoever, are putting up a fierce, but it looks like a losing battle.
I'm not sure that they will lose in the end, actually.
Why?
Because I think that even within the Muslim Brotherhood, there are different tendencies and different threads of ideas. So I agree this is a struggle right now, and by the way, it's the same struggle all over the region. And the point about religion is absolutely central to understanding it. But look, the future, because remember, the other thing about these countries, is really important to remember this. Egypt, half a century ago, had a population of 30 million. Today it's 90 million. Right, so you've got young populations, you've got young people who need jobs and opportunities. The only thing that works in today's economy to create jobs is an open-minded approach. I mean, a narrow view of society or religion doesn't lie with a 21st century economy.
So if I understand you correctly, you're sort of suggesting that the confusion we're seeing in Egypt today, and perhaps even some of the latent violence on the streets of Cairo, is actually a sign that they are struggling to resolve their disputes themselves, and that this was in a way inevitable, and that we shouldn't despair from it, but actually see signs of hope.
Yes, I am saying that, I think, which is not to say that, you know, in the short and medium term, it's not going to be very challenging and difficult, particularly when the result is that the economy doesn't move, you know, because Egypt...
And it's not moving.
Well, it's not moving as it needs to move. And you see, look, if you've got a country like Egypt, which is tourism is a major part of the economy, if you start having the idea that, you know, men and women don't mix together, how do you have a tourist industry? You know, not in the modern world.
And as long as people keep rebelling, resisting that sort of movement towards restriction, towards intolerance, there is hope that the internal dynamic of Egypt will resolve itself, and will resolve itself in favor of pluralism and democracy rather than some form of Islamist fundamentalism.
I think this is both the hope and what we've got to work for, and it's very important right at this moment that those people who are struggling for what I would call the open-minded view of society are given support.
But isn't this hope in a sense contradicted by the fact that in Syria, where people believed that the Assad regime was actually buckling under and would soon topple over, it hasn't. It's standing its ground fairly solidly. It doesn't look as if it's going anywhere. And now people are asking whether the West, in fact, over-anticipated success and exaggerated the strength of the anti-Assad forces.
I think, well, my reading of Syria is that Assad in the end will go, but I agree. I think the big question is what comes next, and again...
And what does he leave behind? Because it may be a destroyed society by then.
Absolutely right, and right now you've got a situation where some of the minorities feel very worried about what will happen once the change comes about. So again, in Syria, the only thing that will work is in the end a constitution in which the rights of minorities are protected.
But to ensure that Syria isn't destroyed in the process, don't you need to find a face-saving exit for Bashar Assad?
I think people aren't against that, by the way. I mean, I have no... For me...
The Americans don't look as if they're in favor of it.
I think even the Americans would consider it if it was part of a dispensation that got a new constitutional settlement that allowed the country to determine its government. But I don't think there's no future if Assad stays. I mean, that's for sure. But, I mean, frankly, I feel the same about any of these regimes. I don't really mind what happens to the person at the top. If you need to deal with that in, as you say, some face-saving way, let's deal with it. What is important is to stabilize the society.
But are we moving in that direction? Is there progress being made towards an exit for Assad, towards a solution for Syria? Because at the moment it looks as if we've got impasse and a continuing, deepening civil war.
There are a lot of efforts going on. I mean, the UN envoy, Mr. Brahimi, is working very hard on that. You know, there are meetings between the Americans and the Russians, the Europeans. You know, people are hoping and trying to find a way through, but it's important they do Basically, in Syria, there are now over 40,000 people that have died in this, so it's worth fighting for.
You know, so much of what we're talking about and the possibility that the future will be better than the impasse, whether we're talking about Israel-Palestine, whether we're talking about Egypt, whether we're talking about Syria, depends upon the role Barack Obama plays. Now, he has a new term as president that begins in just a couple of weeks' time. But the biggest problem he faces is not internationally, he's at home. He's got a Republican majority in the House that's virtually checkmating him. He's facing this fiscal cliff, and people wonder, can he get the Republicans to give him ground, or is he going to topple over the cliff?
I mean, I'm assuming, but this may be naive on my part, that as the moment of going over the cliff approaches, people come together.
But they're not at the moment.
No, but in a way, there's a kind of rhythm to these things where you've got to go right up to the cliff edge before you then agree it's not very sensible to plunge over it.
When you get to the cliff edge, you could just as easily teeter over, even if you don't want to.
Well, and that is a risk, but I mean, I assume and hope that won't happen, and I think, you know, President Obama's positioned this quite cleverly, actually. I mean, I think in the end what he's saying is, look, there's going to have to be a mix of sort of revenue raising and spending cuts, and I sort of see in the positions taken by the two main groups that you can just about see how they can be bridged.
One of the concerns that people have, whether it's President Obama handling the fiscal cliff or whether it's President Obama showing his leadership qualities in the Middle East, is in fact his own leadership itself. During the election campaign that ended in November, people turned around and said at times he was a bit too academic, others said he was indecisive. Do you think, from what you know of him, that the second term will be a different one? Will he be more decisive, more certain?
I think, I mean, knowing him as I do, I actually think he is someone both of very strong convictions, and I expect to see in this second term, I mean, him get through this economic situation. I'm actually pretty optimistic about the American economy if they deal with this fiscal cliff issue. I think there's profound strength in the US economy. I'm more optimistic about that than I am about Europe, for example. And secondly, I think in respect to the Middle East, he does have the authority now to move this forward.
Because of the second term?
Yeah, because he's been re-elected.
And you think that he will show the leadership that's needed both at home and abroad?
I do, yes.
And he'll be able to tackle effectively Palestine, Israel and Egypt, because those are issues that he touched on earlier. He made seminal speeches in Cairo. He tried to get a Middle East peace process going, but nothing came of either.
Well, there were a lot of attempts, but I think on the other hand, you know, there is also a lot of learning that we've got out of this. And the one thing I would say that I think is essential about American policy for this second term is that you take a strategic view of the Middle East that wraps it all in together. So in my view, where there's been revolution, we've got to protect democracy. Where there's not been revolution, we've got to help manage evolution, because nothing in that region is going to remain.
Which means you have to manage the tensions in Saudi Arabia and Kuwait, not least of all in Jordan.
You've got to support evolutionary programs of change there. So, for example, in Jordan, where the king has set out a program of change is important, we support it.
Now, another header government going through a troubled patch, and there seem to be so many at the moment, is in fact your own Prime Minister, David Cameron. He's survived 2.5 years in power. But people ask, will he actually survive the full 5 years, or will he stumble before he gets to the finishing line?
Well, I don't know, really. I mean, you know, I remember, I think it was after about 6 months in government that I had the first person put to me, you know, is this the worst crisis that you've had since you became Prime Minister? And I think I recurrently had that question put to me throughout the 10 years. So, look, he's got the same tough situation that all prime ministers have got in the West at the moment. You know, the economy is a big problem. And, you know...
Ed Miliband doesn't sound quite as understanding of David Cameron's problems as you do.
No, and if I was leader of the opposition, I'd probably... I would be giving him a whacking. But I'm afraid it's you know, having done the job of Prime Minister, I know it's really difficult, and therefore...
Retirement makes one more understanding of your successors.
Well, not being the person trying to remove him from power gives you a little leeway, perhaps.
Does it also make you more understanding of Boris Johnson? Is there a...
He's just been out here, hasn't he?
Absolutely, and he's also married to a lady who's half Indian.
Yes.
Charles Wheeler's daughter is half Indian.
Yes,
but is there a prime ministerial personality lurking behind the buffoonery he often puts up?
I don't know.
Does it worry you that there might not be, and he could be a Conservative leader one day heading towards 10 Downing Street himself?
No, I don't. I mean, look, who the Conservative Party chooses is up to them, really. I mean, I'm more focused on my own political party and hoping they succeed. I mean, it's... but, you know, you learn in politics not to try and make rash judgments about people. I mean, they develop as they develop.
Mr. Blair, let's take a break at that point. When I come back, I want to talk to you about politics, the media, and the case for regulation. That's in a moment's time. See you after the break. Welcome back to The Last Word and an interview with the former British Prime Minister, Tony Blair. Mr. Blair, let me come now to an issue that is of enormous interest and moment at the moment in India, and it's one that you faced yourself as Prime Minister, the media. Does self-regulation work, or does it amount to a license to newspapers and television channels to effectively do what they want?
Well, you know, we've been through this big debate and the Leveson report in the UK. I think freedom only works with responsibility. So whichever way you manage to do this, in the end, I think everyone accepts that the situation was unacceptable and has got to change. I actually think there's a bigger question, though, than this, which is what is the right relationship between the media and politics today? And I think we just need to give each other a bit of understanding. You know, we live in a 24-hour-a-day, 7-day-a-week media environment. It's very different for political leaders today than even when I was first starting as Prime Minister. And it requires, I think, a way of working on both sides that understands the challenges that politicians have and the need for the media to operate as the media. But I think it's a big problem for Western decision makers now, the media.
You're saying that 24-hour television can actually trip up politicians because of the constant probing focus, often sometimes without any understanding of the problem the politician has to handle.
Yes, I think that's right. And I think part of the trouble is that also because the media's got to fill its airwaves 24 hours a day, you know, its obligation is to keep the story moving.
And often they get it wrong as a result because of pressure of deadlines or just lack of sources.
Yeah, and also it's highly competitive today. And you've then got people used to think that the social media would add a kind of responsible dimension. It would be a sort of civilizing force.
It makes it worse.
Well, it certainly in many respects is the opposite. What happens is that it out-sensationalizes the conventional media, and the conventional media then feels it's got to catch up.
So there's a real sense in which Twitter and Facebook are an even bigger problem than television news at 9 or the front headlines the next morning.
Yeah, I just think that social media is like fire. You know, it can warm you and can cook your food, and it's great. But on the other hand, it can burn you. So there's no point in arguing, is it good or bad? Facebook, Twitter, the social media, the internet, it's here to stay. And basically, it's very positive, of course, in many, many ways. But in terms of, you know, political strains, it can create waves of opinion that politicians, I think, find quite destabilizing.
And sometimes get knocked off their feet by.
Correct.
Politicians try the world over to counter this by coming closer to the media, by getting to know, by making themselves more accessible. But is there legitimacy to any relationship of closeness and friendship and intimacy that a politician and a media baron establishes? Or will it always be regarded with suspicion and perhaps even as something that sounds collusive?
I think probably, you know, with some experience of this myself, probably more the latter than the former. I mean, in other words, I think, look, in the end, there is an inevitable tension between us. You know, you're asking me questions now, you've got to get things out of me and you've got to probe where it's right to probe. You know, I'm sitting here thinking, you know, how do I avoid mistakes? How do I make sure I get my point across? There's an inevitable tension there that, you know, I think is just, that's a healthy part of democracy, by the way. I think that's a good thing. But I do think in an era where you've got this very competitive 24-hour-a-day media, plus the multiplying effect of social media, there's a need for us in politics to think about our relationship with you, and I think there's a need for you guys to really focus on what are the best journalistic standards and how do you make sure that they're uniform.
There's a corollary, isn't there, to what you're saying, that from a politician's point of view, it's better to maintain some distance even if you do it at the risk of being misunderstood, than to get too close and be accused of collusiveness?
Yes, I think that in the end, what I learned ultimately is you've got to be out there communicating. And, I would have done far more press conferences to say Margaret Thatcher before me and far greater interaction, probably David Cameron even again from my time. But in the end, we do have different roles. And I think the sort of closeness there's a certain falseness about it, I think. Really.
So respect the difference.
I think respect the difference is sensible.
My last question. There is a debate in India today about what sort of regulation is the best for the media. No one in a democracy would recommend state regulation. But there are many who say that self-regulation simply doesn't work. Do we need some form of independent regulation, or would that inevitably impinge upon press freedom and independence?
Well, I think provided it's independent of government and Parliament, I think it's fine. I mean, independent should be, independent in the sense that if people have got complaints and they take it to the body who's determining them, they should know that they're genuinely independent. And part of the problem with, the purest forms of self-regulation is it doesn't happen. On the other hand, no, I mean, no one wants to see government actually trying to tell the media what to do. And by the way, I don't think in your society or in mine that would work.
I'm sure there are many people listening intently to what you said, Mr. Blair. Thank you very much for this interview.
Thank you.